You're listening to the Story By podcast. This show features short fiction with two things in common. First, I wanted to share them. Second, the rights to option or produce them for other media are available. My name is Lewayne L. White. I'll be the host and narrator. Welcome to the Story By podcast. I'm glad you came by. Today's episode is Coulrophobia by A.J. Bernhagen. I selected Coulrophobia because, frankly, I just saw the movie It this past weekend, and clowns were on my mind. I also like this piece because it has a narrator reminiscent of one in a Poe or Lovecraft story, whose already unstable life spirals further from his control as the story progresses. I thought about saving this one for October, when I'll probably spend the month on more Halloween-esque fare, but, as I said, the clowns were on my mind. Coulrophobia by A.J. Bernhagen. Long before I realized the vastness of the conspiracy, I drew in tight letters on my wall lists of people for which I had acquired an appropriate level of concern. I put their names in tight letters, as I said, for space was an issue, first beneath my colorless light switch. This served the dual purpose of not only providing a frequent reminder for myself as to who I should chase after during my nightly meditations, but it also concealed the contents of the list from the eyes of my mother, who had little reason to ever cross the threshold into my domain, and who also so appropriately appeared at the very top of my list. I had placed a little red X next to her name. And sometimes, for an hour or two before dinner, I would consider the ramifications of her having already fallen prey to the vast conspiracy. Already I have gotten ahead of myself, as is typical of my meandering state of mind. Allow me to start over. When I was in high school, or I should say, when I was in a cell crafted of pale brick, and locked by the collective authority granted to a scant few taskmasters by the overwhelmingly more numerous student body, I was called into the guidance counselor's office and told to have a seat. The man's name was, well, unimportant. I believe it started with a V, which brings to mind some sort of pestilence, for which he was undoubtedly named. It seems a bit odd in retrospect, but even then I noticed his face was far paler than it should have been. He did, after all, coach intramural football or some such nonsense, and spent his afternoons running around a field in spandex shorts. He was a balding man of 33 with a nose like a pencil and a brow like a sledgehammer. I had observed him through his office window an hour or so before my scheduled appointment, and jotted the pertinent facts in my notebook. Not a Hispanic, not a janitor, and probably not a leprechaun. Confirm later. Within moments of beginning our session, I felt his aura shift. It was a slight quivering in which an evil force of considerable magnitudes took hold of him and caused the most horrid, guttural cackle to escape his unshaven throat. It must have been the file laying open upon his desk which brought it about, for he read aloud from the teacher's comments section. Student demonstrates extreme anxiety towards subject matter, often interrupting in loud and entreating gasps that the subject matter could result in nuclear war, or perhaps eternal damnation, which he views as perhaps slightly more favorable than the former. I didn't see what was so funny. The counselor put on these absurd little spectacles and leafed through the rest of the information. Then he sighed, sat back, all of this supposed to assure me of his good intentions, and leveled with me. So, why do you think you're here? Of course I couldn't answer him. A question like that was too clearly meant to trap me into betraying my knowledge. So long as he didn't know what I knew, then I could go on knowing without him being privy to my knowledge. He smiled again. What class is this for? Philosophy, that right? That's right, I said. It would do little harm to give up compromise data. So what's the problem? You don't believe in God? His stupidity weakened me. Of course I believed in God. I had written his name beneath the light switch. He, for all I knew, was the Grand Master of the entire thing. No, nothing? Determinism. How's that? We were talking about determinism. All things are linked by causal chains over which we have no control. In such a system, we have no free will in some definitions. He nodded as though he knew what I was talking about. So, do you believe in free will? I believe my immune system hiccuped, and for a good stretch of 30 to 40 seconds I beleaguered myself with woe at the possibility that I had contracted malaria. No, I managed. No, I do not. More nodding. His color tone frightened me. It seemed to grow whiter and whiter as minutes wore on. He didn't know how to proceed with me. That was clear. But I learned something that day. I realized that those being caught up in the conspiracy might not have knowledge of their involvement. Perhaps there was alien life after all, or a spirit world, or an alien spirit world. How's the home life? How do you mean? Your family okay? They treating you okay? I have sufficient foodstuffs and entertainment when time permits. My work often takes precedent, so I rarely contact them unless the need is dire. Your work? He sounded genuinely interested, which was yet another sign of his incompetence. If they had really wanted to pierce my psyche, they should have sent a professional. Mercifully, a bell sounded in the nearest corridor, and it saved me the trouble of having to think up a rather cunning reply, something to satisfy his need for an answer, any answer, but which would ultimately leave myself secure from further questioning. The counselor scrambled for a piece of paper upon which to write, and as he scribbled, said, "We should meet again. This time looks like it should work with your schedule." Quite naturally, I burned the note forthwith when I had escaped the prison campus, and avoided the counselor so much as was possible without resorting to violence. Perhaps it would be prudent to mention at this point that I had done a good deal of research with regard to myself. One shabby afternoon, when the library was nearly emptied due to the volume of snow, as much as the colossal descent of man into ignorance, I happened upon a collection of books pertaining to disorders of the mind. It took me no long while to find that I had, by DSM-4 criterion, no less than 56 individual abnormalities ranging from compulsions to phobia. I recognized Coulrophobia, the fear of cats, Cyclophobia, the fear of bicycles, Allodoxophobia, the fear of opinions, and, naturally, Anglophobia, the fear of England. But the one which caught my eye, albeit a semi-divergent issue stemming to the depths of the conspiracy, was Capgras syndrome, the belief that a friend or close relative has been replaced by an identical imposter. It struck me as odd that I should just so happen upon a clinical disorder for this reason. I believe I mentioned the list I kept beneath the light switch. For the longest time I had held the secret suspicion that the whole world and everyone in it was somehow privy to a great and impending disaster, and that I was to be the last to know about it. I'm not sure if the doctors had assigned me this role of the odd man out at birth, or if it was in some way connected to galaxies beyond the eyes of telescopes. However, spending a good deal of time reflecting upon this notion, I had begun the arduous task of chronicling the daily activities of my family. I made lists, such as Tuesday, Mother, 1. Awoke, showered. 2. Consumed low-calorie breakfast. 3. fed domesticated feline, intensely evil feline. 4. Purchased poison during afternoon excursion, reasons unknown. It was during the 3rd week of this vital task that I began to notice certain changes in Mother's appearance. I first came to notice it at the dinner table. Her face, or what I thought was her face, seemed to be paler than usual. She was of Native American descent, so any change in her pallor was both readily noticeable and deeply troubling. However, I also came to realize that there seemed to be a kind of reddish, thin seam on the side of her head where the ear meets the hairline. I was unable to finish the meal, and retreated to my domain in order to ponder the issue further. There was still a piece missing. A word about my childhood might be necessary in the course of our discussion of the conspiracy. My youth was not tainted with the brutal outpouring of violence in the form of sporting events and general social chaos. I spent much of the time in religious and philosophical reflection, aided by the works of Plato, Aristotle, and Kurt Cobain. It was a scorching July afternoon when I, as a boy of 8 or 9, sat upon the hill in our backyard pondering certain mysteries of the world as clouds floated by overhead, casting an occasional shadow over the earth and trees and animals. At one point I remember wondering if it had ever happened that clouds, for a flickering moment in the space-time continuum, had become solid objects. Modern science, pitiful, desperately inadequate modern science, would presume that things cannot suddenly change form in such a fashion. However, in order to know such a thing for an absolute fact, one would have to indeed observe directly the forms of all clouds for all time, a task which I began to plan for, before discarding it for a more challenging endeavor. I reasoned that such a thing could and probably had happened, and if it were to happen again, I would hope that a missile defense system would shoot a few of those puffy menaces out of the sky for good. However, the significance of this afternoon was not in the realization that clouds were likely devices of espionage, or at the very least intelligence gathering. I began a train of thought which led me to a startling conclusion. This conclusion affected my base viewpoint on life, meaning, and purpose. I will not repeat the whole spiritual junket for the sake of time. However, someone may find relevance in the application. I believe lies. That is not to say that I take obscure or meaningless concepts and make them truth. I accept that which is demonstrably inaccurate and act as though it were otherwise, all the while keeping in mind that it is, in fact, a lie. So, for instance, when my mother told the employee at some godforsaken amusement park that I was 11 instead of 12, thus saving a hearty $4.50, I, for the remainder of my life, told all who would listen that I was a year younger than I actually was. I removed one candle from every birthday cake that I was ever forced to endure for the sake of pleasantry and family harmony. I avoided employment at a job which paid double the wages I ended up securing on a monthly basis, and I continue to believe in Santa Claus to this day. Consequently, I also developed euphobia, the fear of good news. In keeping stride with our ardent intent of finally reaching the climax of our musings, I must now relate an incident which has, as many days as have passed since its occurrence, beset me with the most horrific terror. The events leading up to our arrival at the circus were by no means trivial. There was an obscene commercial broadcast across the airwaves regarding the time and place of the event. This news was greeted with much fervor and joy by my family unit. Their dispositions toward poppycock and tomfoolery can be traced to their environment and genetics, which in turn can be traced through ancestral occupations and interests, which in turn can be traced through historical context, which in turn can be traced through millions of years of biological evolution, which in turn can be traced through billions of years of cosmic evolution, ultimately ending up at an alleged explosion of incomprehensible proportions, all of which seemed geared at bringing forth a most sly and unseemly conspiracy. Suffice it to say, keeping with our predetermined actions, we came upon the largest tent. one which was plainly an unclean and pagan center of witchcraft and infection. Despite all my zealous intercessions to the Lord, we entered and found seating approximately in the middle of the swamp, stuck to a germ-covered bench like a line of death row inmates awaiting execution by torture. For the first of the 3 unbearable hours of lackluster performances by thin Chinese trapeze artists and so-called exotic animals called from the 4 corners of the earth, I made every effort to ration my energy and avoid despair altogether. But by the second hour, the continuous and displaced mutterings and explosions of joy and wonder on the part of my family began to grate on me like a sandblaster. At one point, I began searching the cockroach-strewn ground for a piercing object sufficient for murder, but found, like Alexander after his mighty conquest, that it was all for nothing. So finding no refuge in physical action and having nowhere near the appropriate level of silence for deep reflection, I cast a wary glance at the whitening faces of my family. It seemed everyone was sunless then, and went off in search of a restroom. I reasoned that if I could at least fulfill a biological necessity during my captivity, then the evening would not be a total waste. After what seemed like years of searching, I came upon the most filthy, grotesque waste removal facility it has ever been my displeasure to visit. It was a shabby red room with crooked mirrors and a foggy atmosphere. I could have conducted experiments on the origins of life in the corner where an armada of mold was festering and plotting its advance. Perhaps it was the circus theme or the general bleakness of the red pallor, but my suspicions truly and rightly flared as I stalked along the wall in search of an available urinal. One by one I discarded the occupied stalls where oafish men with hairy necks and blackened moles stood. Nausea claimed my stomach much like God claimed Israel. That is to say, I was covenantly ill. Then, trumping all the horrors before it, when I had reached the very last urinal, my eyes fell upon a most hideous and ghastly sight, the true nature of which took many days of reflection to appropriately analyze and catalogue. There, with its big, baggy pants hanging down at the front, the thick black suspenders unstrapped and loose around its knees, and one white, gloved hand bracing itself against the wall, whilst the other assured accuracy, was a clown. "Thou evil creature," my mind began to say, before my mouth could catch up, and the effect was a slack jaw and an untamable quivering of the head. The creature must have noticed my presence, for it turned and smiled at me with its big, red lips. Its orange tufts of hair seemed to move about of their own accord. Forever we locked eyes, and the true nature of the conspiracy dawned on me with such force that naught but the power of the sun breaking on the first morn could capture the essence of the revelation. I promptly turned and fled the restroom, and expected the clown to come bounding after me, gaining with every squeak, squeak, squeak of its oversized shoes. I'd look back to find a pronounced scowl outlined by a red smile. Thankfully, my imagination was not as accurate as my reflection periods. Naturally, I could not leave my domain for several days afterward. I suspended all eating and nourished myself with nothing but water caught in a rain trap outside my window. My family, quite used to my customs and regularities, made no effort to forcibly extract me. But then the madness truly settled in my mind. I had horrific visions, some waking, others sleeping. With every fiber of my being, I ardently interceded to the Lord that this most wretched conspiracy would not come to pass. The summation of my entire life fell upon me in those fragile days and nights. I was to be the last man alive, as piece by piece I realized that the end of all things was at hand. How could it be mere coincidence that every person I came in contact with was losing, day by day, their healthful veneer. And was it mere coincidence that when the horrid creature looked into my eyes as it feigned biological processes, it said to me in words beyond speech, "Soon." I wept. Even as I sat there in the dark, my hair having grown and my body withering into cotton, I realized there was no stopping it. In fact, I knew that the moment I opened my door, I would merely be inviting the evil into my domain. They must have gotten to my family by now. That I needn't even bother to confirm. They would be the ones who would at last attempt to capture me, the ingrates. But I was so cunning. I was so wise. When it came about that the sun was setting on the 6th day, I calmed my soul for the final escape and crept towards my window. Carefully undoing the latch and removing the screen, I slunk through the window and landed on the mulch below. The sounds of the street and the eerie silence of the neighborhood greeted me. There were no cars roving about, that was the first thing I noticed, nor were there any pedestrians on the street. I was alone. There was not but one way to survive this holocaust, and it was to escape so-called civilization once and for all. It would be no easy task, as already much, if not all of the world had been conformed to the image of the creature, and having now one shared mind, they would all eagerly pursue my immediate assimilation. Their processes would by now be refined. It occurred to me that it may have begun already, a germ or virus traveling through the air and space and time. I hadn't any time to waste. My body was greatly weakened from lack of food, but nevertheless I raced down the street and took a left at the corner. I couldn't risk an automobile in this environment, besides they'd be expecting it, but perhaps if I found the edge of the city on foot, I could disappear into the farmland and eventually seek out a forest refuge. It was to my great misfortune that necessity guided me through a business district. By then my lungs burned, as did my legs from the effort. My skin was growing paler by the minute, and I knew I must make haste if I was to escape at all. But when I came to the first business on the street, some kind of absurd video rental establishment, all my reflections were confirmed. There, behind the counter, with a blue shirt and a golden watch, was a clown. More so, the customers in line before him were also clowns. I sailed headlong behind the nearest parked automobile and panted. But soon the futility of my predicament dawned. All along both sides of the cursed street, behind great glass fronts of formerly thriving businesses, clowns were stationed. They were not all the exact same, mind you. Some were tall, some were short, some wore Hawaiian casual, others jeans and t-shirts. All were smiling. Panic truly began its work then. I had no choice. I had no time for hesitation. Gathering my last breaths, I rose and dashed down the street, disregarding all the attention forming behind me. It wasn't long before the smiling clowns became scowling clowns. They emptied from their respective businesses and pursued me with religious fervor. I bolted past a car dealership and saw 2 red tufts of hair in the window. Not long after, the hair swiveled round, and a face appeared. The doors of the establishment burst open, and a suited clown came barreling after me with one gloved finger pointing at my frail and sickening body. All the while, I couldn't help but wonder how this could be the end of it all. Little by little, step by step, I found I could not outrun them. I was simply too weak. I dared to glance behind me and realized with horror that there were thousands of them now, furious and frothing, pursuing me with a singular passion, an absolute hatred, and the chorus of squeaks, squeaks echoed up and down the street. The edges of the city were approaching. I do not know if I had made it if they would have ceased pursuing me. Perhaps these beasts were only interested in the greater monuments man had erected. In any case, I was stopped short when a little child clown leapt and grasped my ankle, spilling me and it across the pavement, where I split my chin open and shaved nearly all the skin from both elbows. In an instant they were upon me, 1,000. No, a million clowns, all reaching for me and covering me in their powdery embrace. I could feel their vicious triumph swelling. A great silent rejoicing went out from their black and sinister hearts. The last and greatest threat to their kind had been captured. I did not know then what their intention was with regard to me. I simply remember falling unconscious in their midst without even the strength to weep for myself or my kind. However, even now, as I pen these pages, I do so in full knowledge of their uselessness. There is no one left to warn, and no one left to listen. They have detained me at a hospital of some sort, where daily I can look into the mirror and see my lovely, brightening hair and perpetual grin take the last of me. My split chin is now white along the edges. My family comes to visit, but are unable to speak. My father's saddened red lips speak for him, and my mother's drooping green hair. Soon I will join them, I know. They will not allow me to escape a second time. Soon I will join them, as we all must one day do. Thanks for listening today. I really appreciate it. If you liked the show, please tell your friends, and if you didn't like the show, tell me. You can reach me at storybypodcast@gmail.com, on Twitter at storybypodcast, on Facebook at facebook.com/storybypodcast, and probably at other social media locations as they become available. Show notes are also available at storybypodcastblog.wordpress.com. Today's episode included the following music provided by Kevin MacLeod, Incompetech.com, and edited by Lewayne L. White, and licensed under Creative Commons by Attribution 3.0 license. Impact Moderato, Circus Tent, and Spazzmatic Polka. Thanks again for listening. We'll see you next week.